Welcome to Sanity, a podcast by the New York Sun. My name is A.R. Hoffman, and every week, along with my co-host, Rebecca Sugar, we try to make sense out of the nonsense and bring a little bit of sanity to your week. We have a busy show today. Our top story is the one big, beautiful bill. We'll try to get to big picture on that and sort of see what's happening. Our Make It Make Sense section is going to, I think, look at class actions, look at the latest from the Supreme Court, which just wrapped up its term last week, asylum, birthright citizenship. I think we'll also take a look at another legal case, and that's the verdict of Diddy, which a freak off, not a reek-off, or whatever.
Bring out the baby oil.
Right, bring out the baby oil. And then our turning point, we'll look at we'll preview for you the upcoming visit of Benjamin Netanyahu to the White House, see what could be on the agenda there, and we'll finish it up with our sunburns. So happy early or late, depending on when you listen to this, July 4th, and we're so excited to be with you today.
Right. Okay. And yes, so July 4th, of course, is a day to celebrate our freedom, but also to remember what it takes to preserve it. And so to that end, I've pulled a quote from Thomas Sowell, the great economist and thinker and sort of my Yoda. And he said, if the battle for civilization comes down to the wimps versus the barbarians are going to win. I feel that acutely, given the Mamdani potential for the mayorship here in New York. Yeah. And I want to point out also that we're also celebrating this week with Thomas Sowell's 95th birthday. It's literally 95 years of wisdom and insight that he's been offering the country and the planet. And so throughout this show, whenever we move to a new segment, I am going to bring in a quote from the great Thomas Sowell, because
lucky us.
He is one of the most quotable people in the world, in history, and he has something important to say on absolutely everything.
I think that's totally true about sort of like the barbarians and the wimps. It reminds me of a line from that William Butler Yeats poem, The Second Coming, right? That the worst are full of passion and intensity, and the best lack all conviction. So
leave it to A.R. Hoffman to quote Yeats off the cuff. Well done.
So far we have Yeats and we have Sowell, and maybe we'll get a little Thomas Jefferson in for the Declaration. But okay, let's go to the one big beautiful bill. By the time you listen to this, it may have already passed. Today it's already passed the Senate as we speak on Thursday. It looks like it's rounding the corner in the House.
Hakeem Jeffries right now is taking his sweet time.
And that's a quote, his sweet time, sort of filibustering it. I guess we could start off asking, what you think, Rebecca, or sort of, however you want to approach it. I mean, I guess I'll just say, to summarize it off the top, it makes permanent some of the tax cuts from Trump's first term. It cuts lots off the safety net, gives a lot of money to ICE, immigration enforcement, and at least if the bean counters are to be trusted, really kind of blows up the deficit. So what is your reaction? How are you thinking about the one big beautiful bill?
Well, I'm going to quote Thomas Sowell to start, because this is sort of how I feel. The first lesson of economics is scarcity. There is never enough of anything to fully satisfy all those who want it. The first lesson of politics is to disregard the first lesson of economics. Right? So math and budgets, at least in government, never seem to work together. In our lives, they have to, but in politics, they don't. And so, the deficit is huge if this bill passes. Of course, the administration is saying that it doesn't take into account income from tariffs and growth. And Scott Bessent has been out there sort of talking about that this critique of the bill is not correct. We'll see. Certainly right now, the CBO scoring is not great. And there's debate about the CBO, but okay. I think just the optics of it, of course, are that we just went through this whole DOGE project, and at least the idea, nobody felt that DOGE was going to, fix the entire deficit problem in the United States. But we thought that our elected officials got the message that we didn't want them to spend more. We wanted them to spend less. And clearly that message didn't penetrate. And so, Elon Musk, of course, has been very
Well, this
vocal.
was the hill he chose to die on, metaphorically, right? I mean, this bill, and he's still kind of campaigning against this bill's passage.
Right. And listen, you could say that he's not too happy that his EV subsidies are being taken away. And okay, that's one reason for him not to like it personally, but just really he devoted so much of his time and energy to trying to convince the country that we are on the glide path to financial ruin, and just nobody in Congress seems left or right, save for a few outliers,
a great
cares.
Quote, Trump said, "We're going to stick Doge on Elon."
On Elon. I don't. That is clearly this sort of uniparty thing that's never going away. People we elect like to spend. There are a lot of things about the bill, though, let's say, that I like. Right. Of course, the tax cuts remaining. I don't think we had to wait until the last minute to make that the sort of hostage taking issue here, but okay, the tax cuts are going to remain, and I think that's a good thing. I think all the money for border security is really important, and for refurbishing our military, and so many things in here that are great. Even I think there was in the bill something about the definition of male and female, so I don't know how that became part of this conversation, but everything but the kitchen sink is in there. I like that. I don't understand how we're back here, and I again feel if Doge didn't convince us, or at least our elected officials, that there's an appetite in this country for fiscal responsibility, I'm not sure what ever will.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think you're right to say that this is kind of where the rubber meets the road. There was some thinking of would this have been better off being split into several smaller bills? I mean, this is a kind of question about our legislative process. I think if we sort of zoom out from the merits a little bit and think about the political stakes here, obviously this is another sign of Trump's strength over the GOP and over American politics in general, right? I mean, this bill is likely going to be passed despite real opposition from Republicans. We were told sort of everyone's going to lockstep. They're really not. This is as close as it can get. I think part of the reason for that is because of some of those cuts that these representatives and senators have to defend in their districts. And that goes to your point of like, everyone's always for cuts except when it kind of cuts them. It sort of caps what has been a remarkable June into July for Trump. I mean, from wins at the Supreme Court, which we'll get to at least now what appears to have been a successfully executed strike on Iran combined with a ceasefire. Now the passage of his top political priority, just at least in the short term, right? In the horse race sense, this is a very strong stretch for the president. I think there's some concern for Republicans that if this bill proves unpopular or Democrats succeed in kind of defining it, and polls show that it is kind of underwater now with the American people, is this a liability going into 2026?
Yeah, I mean, that's really the Trump mandate right now, after this passes, is to start selling it in a proper way to the American public. And let's talk about the Medicaid issue, because that seemed to be the biggest bone of contention, and where the Democrats are making some headway in convincing Americans, that their poorest Americans, that their health care is going to be taken away. From what I understand about this bill, that is just simply not true. That what is true is that illegal immigrants who are not entitled to Medicaid will be removed. There was a whole issue with the Senate parliamentarian on that, and that people who are able-bodied will not be getting Medicaid benefits. It was not designed for people who are able to work, but just simply don't. So what do you think about the Medicaid?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no doubt that that's part of it. I mean, I think this, broadly speaking, fewer people will have health care, and you can break it down to say, okay, well, where are those cuts coming from? We'll see. I mean, Democrats often got criticized in the Biden era for passing these gargantuan bills that no one has read. obviously this is a vice that both parties are susceptible to. And
Right.
it's not clear
Right.
anyone really knows what's
Right.
in it, or no one person knows the entirety of what's in it. Trump was saying, that, well,
You don't think Donald Trump has read all the pages?
I don't think he's read a single page, maybe an executive summary, but this bill doesn't touch Medicaid. I mean, obviously that's not true. So, I think I hate, that how we legislate now is pass it and find out what's in it. But it feels like that's kind of like how we do things.
Well, that's what I meant before about, sort of this issue of the tax cuts remaining being the sort of, they use that to hold everyone hostage.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's so much credit being given to Speaker Johnson for having orchestrated this over the last 14 months, is it? But you have 14 months to deal with this issue.
Yeah.
Why are we up against the wall in some deadline always? And why do we then have to say, you better pass this or the tax cuts will go away and then the whole economy will blow up? So then everything is in it and nobody gets to read it.
It's like
no
the
one
kid
has
who does his
time.
homework, the night, studies the night before the final.
Right.
I mean,
Maybe we should
it's totally,
change this
deadline
process.
driven.
It's ridiculous, right? I just feel like I'm being held hostage as an American citizen.
Yeah.
I have to pass something that most people haven't read and that we don't understand, because if we don't, everything will go to pot.
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing that's interesting here is the idea that these tax cuts are going to be permanent. And I don't quite exactly know what that means, but that is a difference from previous tax cuts, which were set to expire and which then provided a kind of leverage or a kind of, negotiating tool, right? So, this bill, could reset the playing field in significant ways. And maybe shift the window of kind of like, okay, like where taxes are or where benefits are or whatever. I think the question of the deficit, as you said, is, whatever ruin it brings us, both parties will have that guilt. I mean, it's truly a collaborative effort to disaster.
Yes. Just most of the people who just passed this probably won't be alive by the time, or won't care that much by the time it does become the disaster that it will be, and it'll be left to people like you and me and our kids to worry about.
Yeah, it's just a little bit confusing to me on the politics of it, in that I don't, it's not clear to me why Trump quite needed this, or why he couldn't have just let's say done the tax cuts and separated it out. I guess that goes to kind of the inefficiencies in how Congress runs. They probably felt they didn't have the bandwidth to do separate kind of bespoke legislation, that it had to be like this, like one big thing, or like you have one shot and that's it.
They have the bandwidth for anything. I just love all the images of, was it Nancy May showing up in her pajamas? So as if to say, like, look how hard I'm working. She pulls like one all-nighter and it's a big deal. The rest of us
floral print pajamas
have been there and done that.
Let me ask you on this though, is, Musk is now let's say beta testing a new party, the America Party. Are you excited for that?
I'm excited to talk about it. I'm not so sure I'm excited to vote for it or not. Let's see what he comes up with. But alternatives never seem like a bad thing to me, especially given the options on the table at the moment. Yeah,
fair enough. Our next section, do we have a Thomas Sowell quote to help us make it make sense?
Yes, of course we do. This is the great Thomas Sowell. Well, this is specific to the illegal immigration decisions on the court. Mr. Sowell says, immigration laws are the only laws that are discussed in terms of how to help people who break them. Nice insight there.
Yeah. So, basically, kind of to maybe we'll do a little bit of a Supreme Court wrap up, put a bow on this term. Trump scored some real wins. We've spoken on this program. I think we spoke last week about nationwide injunctions. Those are sort of out the window, although the possibility of a workaround has now emerged in the form of class action lawsuits. So just to kind of fill folks in, a class action lawsuit is just, if Rebecca and I both, drink tainted water, let's say, or spiked Pepsi, we're similarly situated, right? We have the same injury, and we could band together and say, hey, we want to bring this suit on behalf of both of us, and maybe our producer Micah also, drank that Pepsi. So it enables people to kind of join together. I mean, class action suits historically are generally in the realm of personal injury, right? Because it would be, okay, there was asbestos in this whole building, so everyone is a similarly situated plaintiff and can be treated as one. for the purposes of the suit, and then of course share in whatever reward or damages are dispersed at the end of the trial. And this came up during Supreme Court. So basically, the news here is that a judge, notably a judge who had stopped the birthright citizenship order, said all expectant mothers now are a class to challenge for the purpose of challenging the birthright citizenship executive order. And so it's kind of like a universal injunction by any other name, because to address the needs of the class, you're going to have it's like the ultimate universal injunction.
I had a question about that. Is it typically the judge who creates the class in a class action suit?
The judge has to certify a class. So I can, and
the lawyers bring the case with a class already designated and the judge certifies it. Is this new that he just created the class out of thin air?
No. The ACLU said we want to be considered a class. And there are certain factors that a judge considers. And this can be a big point of litigation, right? And oftentimes defendants will try to fight a class being certified. They'll say, actually this class, they're not all similar, right? Or they actually aren't best considered as one group. And the factors that go into the creation of a class can be, do they have similar experiences? Are they similarly situated? Is the interest of justice best served by treating them as a class, right? Is it most efficient? So we have a class certified on birthright citizenship now. And as of yesterday, we have a class certified on this challenging of the Trump's policies on asylum. So class actions might be the kind of next frontier now. We at The Sun have had a couple of editorials about this in terms of allowing district court judges to stop Trump's agenda.
So would the Trump administration's appeal of this most recent decision by the federal judge in Washington include some mechanism by which they could get SCOTUS eventually to rule on whether or not judges can use this workaround as a way to get around the first SCOTUS decision? Yeah,
and Justice Alito said pointedly in the injunction, that he doesn't want to see judges just, use class actions instead of universal injunctions.
Right. And of course, that's exactly what the first federal judge who had the opportunity did.
Right.
So the question is, how do we stop this from becoming the problem going forward every time the president wants to do something?
Yeah. I mean, I think, one, on this birthright citizenship issue, it just highlights for me that the court is going to eventually have to decide this on the merits, right? Because this is going to keep coming up in different forms. For other kinds of executive orders, it would have to be a case-by-case basis. Like, does it make sense to think of it as a class, right?
Well, let's say on this case, in the asylum seekers, right? President Trump issued an EO some time ago saying that you can't just run across the border and claim asylum status, and therefore you're basically effectively here indefinitely. And this judge said, no, this is a class of people, I guess, and you can't. He put it on pause while the Trump administration is appealing. So, that would suggest now that Trump's EO is, ineffective. People can just still run across the border and say, help, I'm a refugee, or I'm claiming asylum status. How do we prevent that from being like is that a class? Anybody who runs across the border? Isn't that a really broad category? Or is there some way to limit the way these judges are creating classes that should be part of the Trump appeal, so that the next case and the next case after that, we're just not repeating, washing and repeating?
No, it's a great question. I mean, I think what you're going to see is, some judges who are already unsympathetic to Trump will be more likely to certify classes, and others will be less likely, right? They'll say this isn't really a coherent class in that way. Certification of a class can be challenged on appeal, right? So we'll just see more of these kind of challenges. On the asylum issue, on the merits, the judge said, well, the president can't change asylum policy. That's run through like legislation and through law. So that's another real battle to watch, because that has been a key tool that Trump has used, the limitation of asylum claims.
The certification of a class, you just said, is subject to appeal. Does that appeal set precedent for the next certification of class, or is it specific to the one that was brought to appeal? In other words, if he appeals Trump and says this is ridiculous, this was too broad of a category for this judge to assign as a class, would that mean that the next judge is more limited in what he can assign as a class?
Well, as you go higher up, right, the only court that has kind of precedent overall of America is the Supreme Court. So you could have, in the Second Circuit, something is considered a class. In the Ninth Circuit, it's not. But eventually that would be something that's called a circuit split. The Supreme Court would eventually want to kind of probably weigh in there and say, like, right, is this a class or is it not a class? But especially with immigration, it in a way, it lends itself to these classes. I mean, we spoke about this last week, Rebecca, that, it's sort of, it will be kind of strange if, in 20 days, whatever the time is, you have different rules on citizenship based on different what state you live in, right? Mm-hmm. So that's the thinking behind this. But the court's conservative majority could say, we ruled against nationwide injunctions. You can't just use class action as a replacement, as a way to skirt that ruling. Let's get maybe to a more. That's all very kind of like highfalutin, but let's get to Diddy.
We just dropped like 10 points.
We're like we're free falling. Yeah. We're free falling. We're plummeting.
Yeah.
You've said that I mean, not just you, but you articulated the sort of depravity of some of the evidence that was put on trial, how disgusting it was, all of that. What was your reaction to the verdict?
Back to Thomas Sowell, who said, one of the common failings among honorable people is a failure to appreciate how thoroughly dishonorable some other people can be and how dangerous it is to trust them. So it doesn't look like Diddy is going to serve a lot of time in the end. Yeah. We'll see what happens. 10 years maximum on each count of the 2 counts, and that'll be reduced. Maybe it'll be
seems unlikely to be 10 years.
Yeah, he'll get out whenever he gets out. So here's what we're left with, right? First of all, I just want to say I was sort of surprised that in the very beginning of this case, when it broke, I thought this was really a case about his abuse of minors, people like Justin Bieber when he was still a minor, and the drugging of men and women at these parties and raping them while they were unconscious. And it just doesn't seem to have factored in here. But anyway, I didn't read all the transcripts. So that aside, on this bigger question of the sort of disgusting nature of what actually went on in these parties is this idea that, maybe people who would never buy 100 jars of baby oil and go to freak-offs can't imagine that there are people who do that. But now that we know, and we've seen Diddy and we've seen Epstein and we've seen so many examples of this in our culture and particularly in the world of celebrity, maybe we could all, remember that these people, generally, there are good people among them, of course, but why do we listen to celebrities about literally what sneakers to buy or, God forbid, who to vote for? When you have examples like this, and it's not just Diddy, of course, it's everybody was at that party, one of them over years, who never said a word about what was going on. So it's every celebrity we have ever heard of that I can name basically is in some way complicit in the either illegal activity or just straight up disgusting low down stuff that went on. And as a class, celebrities, maybe the judge would like to take up this as a class.
I was just going to say class action,
of people that are not what Thomas Sowell would call honorable. And we should all just at least go watch their movies and listen to their music if you want to, but don't idolize them and don't take their advice on anything, because now we know who we're dealing with. Yeah.
Point well taken. Just to kind of give you a little bit of like the legal kind of like analysis. I think one, and you articulated this, Rebecca, when you said, we have the evidence and then somehow we have this verdict and there seems like a disconnect, or we have the charges. I think one is just sort of the limits of the law a lot of times. I mean, a trial and these charges, you don't always feel like they fit what happened. There's kind of like a dissatisfaction. I know people on the defense team. I worked with them when I was a lawyer. These are smart people, and it just shows. You sometimes can take a case, and you're like, how are you gonna, the evidence is so clear. I mean, we all saw that video, and it's just, but there were real, I think, prosecutorial errors made here. I think first and foremost was, and this is something at the Sun we've written about, is classifying this as a racketeering case, which is a specific legal word that kind of basically means this giant criminal enterprise and conspiracy. And I think the jury just didn't buy that. They didn't buy that. They said this is discussing these individual acts are abusive, and the defense, and this is a good lesson in defense lawyering for young lawyers, they acknowledged they said, this, you're going to see awful things, and so it's kind of, you admit what you can't defend, right? And you kind of, in a sense, neutralize it.
Professor Alan Dershowitz, whom we interviewed a few weeks ago, commented on this case and said that the prosecution simply overcharged.
They overcharged. They were tempted by the fact that racketeering cases it's like a siren call, because if you can prove it, you can get huge prison sentences. You can loop in lots of kinds of behavior. But I think the other, and this is, they're kind of uncomfortable and difficult questions here, is, for a lot of the jury, they felt that a lot of this behavior was on some level consensual.
Some of it was. And they had, text messages illustrating that fact, I can't wait for the next freak off, things like that. One of the defendants is still having her rent paid
by
Diddy.
So those are bad facts for the government. And, and it's sort of amazing. Mark Niffel, the lead defense lawyer, said, this is a case in some sense about sexually empowered women. I mean, just amazing.
That was a bit of a stretch.
But I think when you're trying to, when the argument was that he's this, criminal mastermind who's forcibly trafficking people, that didn't seem to everyday jurors to match the reality of what they were seeing. Right.
I don't understand why they didn't bring in some of the people who claimed that they were drugged at these parties and raped. Those people really have a case there,
Yeah. But if that's the case, they should have just charged assault, rape, these kind of.
Well, why do you think they did overcharge?
I think, prosecutors are ambitious, and they wanted to, tell a story that was big and elaborate and interesting. And, I think there was also a kind of narrative challenge of things like assault are not sexy. I mean, they're sort of basic charges. And I think, you have this as some of the best lawyers in the country, and there's a danger that you sort of create something so, it makes so much sense on paper. But then when jurors are exposed to, the reality of what was kind of a messy, I'm by no means defending Diddy. I just think that some of the evidence suggested that this wasn't to allude to our, interview with Charles Jacob, which you'll hear on Sunday, that this wasn't like a slave ring. And so I think some of the jurors kind of called bullshit on that.
And I think you're right to say that, they wanted to tell a story. I'm glad they did. At least that. It might not have been the smart thing to do legally, but having all of us know this story and see even little bits of it, I hope will convince us all to get off our addiction to celebrity. It's as toxic as sugar and cocaine. These are not people to adhere to and to follow and to worship.
And to be fair, he was convicted on 2 counts, but I think, you saw the pictures of the defense team after, and they were all smiles. I mean, it was a win. Our turning point. Do you have another quote for us?
Thomas Sowell.
Wonderful.
Literally any subject. We're just going to do this for all shows from now on. It's just all going to be Thomas Sowell. We'll just read his
quotes. And,
Endless. Thomas Sowell on peace and ceasefires. He said, the Middle East must lead the world in ceasefires. If ceasefires were the road to peace, the Middle East would easily be the most peaceful place on the planet. In the short run, they save some lives, but in the long run, they cost far more lives by lowering the cost of aggression. So that, as we are now discussing a ceasefire with Hamas.
Well, that's well, you need to think about that. obviously we have one ceasefire now with Iran that seems to be holding for the time being. It looks like as we speak on Thursday, again, things can change, that a ceasefire agreement with Hamas does seem to be like it's rounding into shape. I think obviously the first thing we have to say, just on a human level, is, we want as many hostages back, and certainly the living ones, and as well as the dead ones. So that's something worth celebrating. I will say, I think I understand this sort of objection to ceasefires, and certainly to one with Hamas. But I do think that, Israel, and with America's help, has effectively shown now that, it's willing to do what needs to be done, right? And so, for example, with Iran, if Iran made movements towards building a nuclear weapon, I think Israel would go in again. So I think there's been a certain breakthrough in terms, and we're living in a new kind of paradigm after October 7th, and so I'm less concerned that a ceasefire now means like, oh, we can never do anything again.
Yeah, by the way, I should point out that quote is not from this particular moment. I
Sure.
think that was from maybe a year ago when he said that. But I think his general point might be true. And we might have gotten to this point where, we have this series of ceasefires and we'll hand you back this many hostages and that many, because we've allowed so many to happen in the past and we've set precedent. But I take your point, and I'm not sure I would know what to do. And certainly if I were the parent of one of the two boys that they released the live videos of them, the hostages, just yesterday, was it? Ceasefire all day long, just send the hostages home. I understand it. I also, shortly after October 7th, I was in Israel, and Yoav Gallant, the former defense minister, was talking to us. And I specifically asked him the question, like, what's the price that the IDF pays for an actual ceasefire? Like, how much time can you afford to give up? Does it allow, at that time, Hamas to rearm and to regroup? And he was very confident even then that, of course, the IDF doesn't agree to any ceasefire of any period of time that they can't afford to give up. So, I have to assume that the IDF understands, and Hamas in this particular case was asking for full cessation, a commitment to cessation of the war altogether on Israel's side, which Israel has not agreed to. And so a ceasefire is a better outcome for Israel than what Hamas wanted.
I also think, it's becoming clear that I think Israel at least is sort of, nearing the completion of its military objectives. And there's a cost. I mean, there's a cost, first and foremost, in Israeli lives. I mean, there have been devastating loss of soldiers in the last week and a half. Devastating. The issue of the deaths of Palestinian civilians is not going away, and is exacting a cost on Israel worldwide. And at a certain point, I think military operation has to give way to political judgment. And the question is, what are the opportunities here? And I, for one, find even the possibility of some kind of agreement with Syria remarkable. I mean, people think Syria, whatever. Syria was Israel's probably primary enemy for its first, 30, 40 years of its existence. I mean, astonishing. That's, go get that. Go get that. And who knows what lies beyond that, whether it's Indonesia or other countries, or of course Saudi Arabia eventually. So I'm really, optimistic at this moment. I think there's real opportunity to really reshape the map, with Iran kind of taken out, Hezbollah taken out, Hamas taken out, to sort of create a new landscape.
I'll try to be optimistic with you. I think, some critics are worried that President Trump is pushing for ceasefire, because it's nice to have those wins, those moments with Syria and the Abraham Accords, and those are wins, and we want them. He also has a base to worry about, and the Russia-Ukraine war doesn't seem to be ending, and he promised to end wars, so this was a war he could potentially end, and so there was pressure, and some people are not thrilled about that. But I don't know what the alternative would be to just keep going. And as you say, this narrative about the how many Gazan civilians have been killed and what's going to happen to them next has only gotten bigger. It hasn't gotten smaller. It's not going to get smaller. And so I think it's probably in Israel's best interest to find some way to move into a ceasefire so that they're not, you know, subject to that line of attack all the time.
Yeah.
And then the question is going to be what happens to the people who remain in Gaza, and where will they go if the place is going to be rebuilt? Who will manage it after that? How long will it take? All those questions, they're being worked on, but I don't think there are any clear answers yet.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. You know, I think some kind of Arab, you know, involvement, whether it's the Gulf states or someone else, is going to be necessary to sort of like administer it.
No one's really eagerly raising their hands.
No one really wants to do that. But, you know, even the fact that this aid distribution mechanism has been set up, you know, shows that like you can have sort of outside, you know, and obviously that's a very limited kind of program, but still, you know, that can you create sort of even interim structures,
right,
you know, in Gaza that assure basic, basic
but
services.
Don't you feel ultimately, you know, those people who are living there cannot live there?
Yeah.
It's not just going to be constant aid while they live amongst the rubble and the bulldozers are going to come in around them. Don't you feel that there's going to have to be some kind of population move here in order to, if the goal is to rebuild?
I think politically that's going to be really difficult.
But practically, forget politically, just practically.
I don't know. I don't know, you know, to what extent, you know, obviously there are certain areas of Gaza that are basically leveled, you know, but is that the entirety of it? I just don't have a real sense. I don't see 1 million people leaving. I just don't know how you even do that or where they go. You know, but I think it's time to, you know, start asking those questions, and the more Israel can kind of get ahead of that, and the more Israel can sort of start to say, okay, like we're now interested in being a constructive partner in this, and you know, the better.
When you say you're optimistic, certainly about the potential for more countries entering the Abraham Accords, certainly about Israel not sending its boys to fight every day, and Palestinian civilians not dying every day. What are you optimistic about in terms of the future of Gaza and whatever the Palestinian people needs?
Yeah. Well, you know, first of all, I mean, I think how can you not be a sort of optimist at the moment about Israel? I mean, I just saw that the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange performed the best of any stock exchange in the world, the first part of 2025. You know, Israel is at this point, it's a colossus. I mean, it's you know, it's, as I said, it's destroyed the proxies, it's really set back Iran. I mean, you know, if you would have said this is where we were after October 7th, you would have thought it was a fairy tale. So, and working closely with the US. So I've, you know, certainly the Iranian cloud has, if not totally been lifted, at least dispelled. And that's huge, right? That was really the only existential cloud Israel faced. And it's been alleviated. So, you know, in terms of Gaza, I think the argument would just have to be somehow for a fresh start, that obviously, you know, Hamas had immiserated its population. It had inflicted violence on Israel and horrific violence on their own people. And I just hope, you know, that whatever comes next is better. You know,
just always feels to me like Oslo, shades of Oslo. A lot of hope, a lot of wanting what's best, and very few practical plans for how to get there. And hope doesn't seem to overcome reality in that part of the world. Yeah.
Well, I think, like I said,
I'm such a downer.
You're such a downer. I mean, I think also, we'll see. I mean, you know, it's you know, people before Trump struck Iran, they said, well, this is going to be another Iraq. And obviously it wasn't. It's a different situation. So I think the question always with the past is, how much do you learn from it? How much are you, you know, do you repeat it? You know, to what extent can you break a pattern, you know, and have something be different. But it's a huge question. The question of how do you create a humane, livable, decent government in Gaza is the question that I hope really smart people on all sides are thinking about. Okay, our sunburns. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to talk about University of Pennsylvania, my alma mater. The University of Pennsylvania is going to be banning biological males from women's sports, and they're going to send apology letters to all their female athletes who are impacted by the decision to allow Leah Thomas at the time to scoop up all the medals in the women's swimming team. And so that was a big announcement. They sort of, I guess, are caving to a lot of the Trump administration's pressure, as they should. I have long been ashamed of my alma mater for a lot of reasons. This was one of the major ones, that an elite institution that's supposed to cultivate leadership couldn't lead on the issue of just who is a man and who is a woman, and couldn't lead on the issue of protecting its own female athletes. Always felt like a stab in the heart to someone who went to that school and used to say nice things about it. But I've recovered from that malady. And I have another quote from Thomas Sowell, and I'm going to end with this, and this is sort of how I feel about the University of Pennsylvania and its sort of image as this academic institution of high regard, and all the smart people who are there and who came out of there. Thomas Sowell said, "It doesn't matter how smart you are unless you stop and think." So I think that the university should have stopped to think about jumping on the sort of trend of the day and the bandwagon and trying to be woke and cool. Should have remembered that they are a serious, or were a serious institution, and should have done the right thing and not the politically correct thing.
Yeah, I mean, the more, well said, Rebecca, and the more you dig with these schools, I mean, we didn't even get to the president of Colombia with text messages, saying, get the Jew off the board. It's just, it gets worse and worse. It's just unbelievable.
There's a Jew, go get him. Yeah.
So my sunburn is going to be about the Glastonbury Music Festival and the chants of death to the IDF. I think many of us have seen the videos, been shocked by the videos. We've had the BBC apologize. Government investigations are now launched. Not too confident anything's going to come of that. But I think there's been this response to say, well, that's not really the story. The story is the war. It's not really the story. And I just want to say Glastonbury is the story. That widespread and virulent anti-Semitism is a huge part of the story. It's part of what has now erupted in the wake of the war. That's always was there in some ways, but I think one can't understand Israel's posture or the posture of many, many Jews around the world without understanding just how unnerving and infuriating it is to see, hundreds of thousands of people chant death to the IDF. It's truly, I think, will be a watershed moment, that this sort of virus of anti-Semitism is, on the contrary, not being contained. It's actually spreading. And I hope for many of us, it was a moment to kind of steel your spine and have a sense of what we're up against, and the fight that we need to have and that is worth having. I just want to add, on the opposite night to a sunburn, sunlight, tomorrow is July 4th, and I really feel it this year. I mean, sometimes you say, whatever, July 4th barbecue, but I think just the pride in being an American, I think seeing a lot of this anti-Semitism that obviously is here too, but feeling that in so many ways America has been and continues to be a beacon and on the right side of the fight, whether it's anti-Semitism or other things. It's the greatest country. It really is. When I was leaving Israel and passing through Jordan, I was speaking to some of the Israeli border police there, and America had just decided to bomb the Iranian nuclear sites, and to a person, they all said, God bless America. And it's not just about that act. It's sort of about being on the right side of history and sort of standing tall in a world that often seems crazy, about being American sanity in an insane world.
Agree. Well said. And just to put a fine point on that, back to Thomas Sowell and the wimps versus the barbarians, right? I mean, it's our responsibility not to be wimps in this fight and to assert ourselves. And the anti-Semitism that you're talking about, to me, is as an American and a Jew, it's best resolved by doubling down on my commitment to America and American values, which protect American Jews in ways that Jews have only dreamt of throughout history and around the world. And American values are really not just Jews' best bet in America. It's every single community's best bet around the world. And so this July 4th, we should all be not wimps, and we should push back against the barbarians. And we should celebrate the great Thomas Sowell, one of the great Americans of our time.
Yeah. And happy July 4th. We'll see you next week.